Just 5 minutes ago, a decision was made that no one inside the palace saw coming, or perhaps no one wanted to believe. A quiet refusal, delivered without spectacle, has sent shockwaves through royal corridors. No official statement, no carefully crafted explanation, just a firm, unmistakable line drawn in silence. And at the center of it all, Princess Eugenie. What could possibly push her to take such a bold, irreversible stand against Camilla? And why now? Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. It didn't arrive with drama. No raised voices, no public confrontation, no moment that cameras could capture and dissect. Instead, it came as something far more unsettling certainty, the kind of quiet, immovable certainty that doesn't ask for permission and doesn't offer explanations. Eugenie's refusal wasn't phrased as hesitation. It wasn't framed as scheduling conflict or personal distance. It was absolute. She would not attend any event hosted by Camilla this year. Not one. And in a system where even the smallest absence is noticed, this wasn't just a decision, it was a disruption. Inside the palace, the reaction wasn't immediate outrage. It was confusion first, then urgency, then something closer to fear. Because this wasn't how things were supposed to happen. Royal disagreements were meant to stay contained, softened by protocol, buried beneath polite appearances. But this slipped through the cracks. Insiders already aware of delicate undercurrents reportedly moved quickly not to challenge Eugenie, but to manage the fallout. Conversations shifted tone, schedules were quietly reconsidered. And somewhere in the middle of it all, a question began to take shape that no one could comfortably answer. How long had this been building? What made it even more striking was who it came from. Eugenie had never been the one to disrupt. She was known for balance, for navigating expectations with care, for maintaining a sense of calm even when tensions quietly lingered beneath the surface. And yet, this decision carried none of that softness. It felt different, sharper, as if something had changed not suddenly, but finally. That's what unsettled those closest to the situation. Because this didn't feel impulsive, it felt resolved, like the final move in a conversation that had been happening for far longer than anyone publicly acknowledged. Almost immediately, speculation began to spread in whispers rather than headlines. This wasn't about a single invitation declined. It wasn't about timing, or mood, or coincidence. The scope of it the entire year made that clear. This was a withdrawal, a deliberate step back from something specific. Something or someone Eugenie had decided she could no longer stand beside, at least not in the way she once had. And the absence of a response from Camilla's side only deepened the unease. Because silence in a moment like this doesn't calm the narrative. It sharpens it. It leaves space for interpretation. And in that space, doubt begins to grow. The palace thrives on appearance, on continuity, on the illusion that everything moves forward without friction. But this decision interrupted that rhythm. It forced attention onto something that had likely been kept just beneath the surface for years. And as the initial shock began to settle into something heavier, more complex, one truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about what had happened today. It was about everything that had led up to it, every quiet moment, every unspoken tension, every fracture that had gone unnoticed or deliberately ignored. Because a decision like this doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from accumulation, from moments that don't make headlines but leave lasting impressions, from boundaries crossed or perhaps never properly defined. And now, those hidden layers were beginning to press outward, threatening to turn something private into something far more revealing. But to understand why Eugenie would take such a drastic step, we have to go back to the quiet fractures that had been forming long before today. For years, everything looked perfectly composed on the surface: smiles, appearances, carefully choreographed unity. But behind closed doors, something wasn't right. Small moments, subtle glances, unspoken distance. What the public saw as harmony may have been nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion, because long before today's shocking refusal, there were signs, quiet, almost invisible cracks that hinted at a relationship slowly unraveling between Eugenie and Camilla. At first, those cracks were easy to dismiss. That's how these things always begin, not with confrontation, but with discomfort so faint it barely registers. A pause that lingers a second too long. A smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. A moment where two people share the same space, yet seem to exist in entirely different emotional worlds. Those who watched closely, really closely, began to notice that something felt off. Not dramatically, not enough to spark headlines, but enough to leave an impression that refused to fade. There were events where Eugenie's presence felt distant, not physically absent, but emotionally removed, as though she were fulfilling obligation rather than connection. And it wasn't consistent, which made it harder to define. Some appearances felt normal, even warm. Others carried a subtle tension, the kind that doesn't explode, but quietly tightens. And over time, those inconsistencies began to form a pattern, one that suggested this wasn't rando, it was evolving. Then came the gradual shift, so subtle it almost went unnoticed at first. Engagements closely tied to Camilla began to pass without Eugenia's involvement. At first it could be explained away, scheduling conflicts, personal priorities, perfectly reasonable excuses. But as those moments increased, the explanations began to feel thinner, because absence, when repeated often enough, stops looking accidental. It starts to feel intentional. Beneath all of this, there were whispers never confirmed, never openly discussed, but persistent enough to carry weight. Differences, not loud disagreements, not dramatic clashes, but something quieter and far more complicated, a divergence in perspective. In values, in the way certain decisions were viewed, certain behaviors interpreted. And while those differences never surfaced publicly, they may have shaped everything behind the scenes, because tension doesn't always need conflict to grow. Sometimes it only needs silence. There were also moments small, almost forgettable to the outside world, that carried a different kind of significance internally. Instances where Eugenia appeared slightly out of place within certain dynamics, as though the space around her had subtly shifted. Whether that distance was imposed or chosen remains unclear, but what mattered was the effect. Because once someone begins to feel disconnected, even in the smallest ways, that feeling doesn't disappear, it lingers, it builds, and perhaps most telling of all was the possibility that something had changed within Eugenie herself. Not visibly, not in a way that could be easily pointed to, but internally, as if at some point something had been seen, understood, or experienced that altered her perception entirely. Because people don't draw lines like this without reason. They don't step back so completely unless something has pushed them there. What makes this even more unsettling is how long it may have gone unspoken. No statements, no clarifications, just a slow accumulation of moments that never quite made sense on their own, but together tell a very different story. A story of tension that wasn't resolved, only buried. Of distance that wasn't addressed, only ignored. And of a relationship that may have been unraveling long before anyone realized it was at risk of breaking completely. And then, something happened, something that insiders now believe changed everything, pushing Eugenia from silent endurance to open defiance. There is always a moment, the one that shifts everything from tension to breaking point, according to whispers circulating within palace walls. That moment came recently. And it wasn't small. It wasn't subtle. It was the kind of incident that doesn't just hurt, it redraws boundaries. What exactly happened remains hidden from the public eye, but one thing is certain. After that moment, Eugenie was never going to play along again. No one saw it happen, not in the way the public understands seeing. There were no statements, no controlled leaks, no carefully worded clarifications to soften the edges. But inside those guarded spaces, something unfolded that insiders now describe in fragments, never fully, always cautiously. A conversation, perhaps, or something more charged than that. A confrontation that didn't begin as one, but became unavoidable. Because when tension has been building quietly for so long, it doesn't need much to ignite it, only needs the right moment. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just that it happened, but how deeply it appears to have cut. This wasn't a minor disagreement over protocol or preference. This carried emotional weight, the kind that lingers, the kind that forces a person to stop, to reassess, to question everything they had previously accepted, without resistance. There are suggestions, quiet but persistent, that something said, or perhaps something revealed, crossed a line that could not be undone. And once that line was crossed, there was no returning to the version of events that had existed before. Some believe it was perceived as a betrayal, not the dramatic kind that unfolds in public, but something far more personal. Something that doesn't just challenge trust, it dismantles it. Because within a structure built on hierarchy and expectation, trust becomes fragile. And when it breaks, it doesn't shatter loudly. It fractures silently, spreading beneath the surface until the damage is impossible to ignore. If that's what happened here, then Eugenie's reaction wasn't sudden, it was inevitable. What followed, according to those close enough to feel the shift, was not immediate action, but emotional fallout, a period of quiet distance, of internal conflict. Because walking away, especially in a system that doesn't easily allow it, is not a simple decision. It requires something more than frustration. It requires clarity, and it seems that clarity came, slowly but definitively, as Eugenie began to reevaluate not just the situation, but her place within it, what she would accept, what she would no longer tolerate, and most importantly, what she was willing to risk by choosing differently. Perhaps even more revealing is the suggestion that others were aware, that this moment, whatever form it took, did not exist in isolation, that it was witnessed, or at least understood, by those who chose not to step in, and that silence, intentional or not, may have spoken louder than any words ever could, because sometimes the absence of support becomes its own kind of message, one that confirms what someone already fears, that they are standing alone, and that is where everything shifted. What had once been internal, contained, ageable, began to move outward. The conflict was no longer something Eugenie could carry quietly. It demanded action, not dramatic, not explosive, but decisive. A line drawn not in anger, but in certainty. A refusal that would eventually surface, not because it was meant to create noise, but because it could no longer remain hidden. And when that decision finally emerged, it didn't feel like a reaction. It felt like a conclusion. The final step in a process that had been unfolding for far longer than anyone outside those inner circles could fully understand. Because moments like this don't appear out of nowhere. They arrive when everything else has already been exhausted, when silence has failed, when patience has worn thin, when the cost of staying becomes greater than the cost of stepping away. But what makes this even more explosive isn't just what happened, it's what Eugenie's refusal now threatens to expose. Refusing to attend a single event might raise eyebrows, but refusing every event hosted by Camilla for an entire year, that's not just personal. That's a statement, a calculated one. Because in the royal world, absence speaks louder than words, and Eugenie's absence isn't just noticeable, it's impossible to ignore. The question is, who is this message really meant for? In a system built on symbolism, showing up is never just about presence, it's about alignment. Every appearance carries meaning. Every shared platform signals unity. Every carefully timed interaction reinforces the image the institution depends on. And that's why Eugenie's decision cuts deeper than it first appears. By stepping away completely, she isn't just removing herself from events, she's withdrawing her visible support. Quietly, but unmistakably. And in a world where even the smallest gesture is scrutinized, that kind of silence becomes deafening. What makes this even more disruptive is how precisely it targets a specific space within the royal structure. These are not random absences, they are selective, focused. Each missed event becomes part of a larger pattern, one that cannot be dismissed as coincidence. And with every absence, the narrative shifts slightly. Questions begin to surface, not loudly at first, but persistently. Why isn't she there? Why now? And perhaps most importantly, what does she know that others don't? Behind the scenes, this creates a different kind of tension, because royal events are not just ceremonial, they're carefully orchestrated moments designed to project cohesion. Remove one key figure from that equation, and the balance begins to feel off. Subtly at first, then more noticeably. Adjustments have to be made. Explanations have to be considered. And all of it happens under the quiet pressure of maintaining control over a narrative that is slowly slipping beyond reach. There is also something undeniably strategic in the way this has unfolded. This isn't avoidance. It doesn't feel like retreat. If anything, it feels like positioning. A refusal that doesn't close the door completely, but instead leaves it open just enough to force attention. Because by choosing absence over confrontation, Eugenie has created a space where questions can grow unchecked. And in that space, uncertainty becomes powerful. It invites speculation, it invites interpretation, and most importantly, it invites response. But that response hasn't come, not yet. And that absence of reaction only amplifies the impact of Eugenie's decision. Because now, it's no longer just about what she has done. It's about what others will do next, whether they acknowledge it, challenge it, or continue to remain silent. And each of those choices carries its own consequences. Because silence in a moment like this doesn't neutralize tension, it deepens it. At the center of it all is something more personal, something that goes beyond strategy or optics. Because stepping outside expected behavior in an environment like this is not without cost. It requires a willingness to face uncertainty, to risk misunderstanding, to stand apart in a system that values unity above all else. And that's what makes this decision so compelling. It's not just calculated, it's courageous. Or perhaps, from another perspective, it's dangerous. Because once a line like this is drawn, it cannot easily be erased. And yet, for all its boldness, this move raises a possibility that is far more unsettling than the refusal itself. Because actions like this rarely exist in isolation. They reflect something broader, something deeper, something that may not yet be fully visible. And as the palace works to steady itself, to maintain the appearance of control, a question begins to surface, quiet at first, but impossible to ignore. And as the palace tries to maintain control, one uncomfortable possibility begins to surface. What if Eugenie isn't alone in how she feels? What if this isn't just Eugenie's story? What if her refusal is only the first visible crack in something much bigger? Because behind the polished image of unity, there are whispers, quiet alignments, unspoken loyalties, and tensions that run deeper than anyone has publicly acknowledged. And if those whispers are true, then Eugenie's decision may not isolate her. It may reveal a divide that has been hiding in plain sight. Because institutions like this don't fracture suddenly. They shift slowly, almost imperceptibly, long before anyone dares to name what's happening. And in those shifts, alliances begin to form, not loudly, not formally, but in quiet understanding. A glance held a little longer, a silence that feels intentional. A moment where someone chooses not to speak, and that choice carries more meaning than words ever could. These are the signals that rarely reach the public, but inside the inner circle, they are impossible to ignore. There have been suggestions, careful, cautious, never confirmed, that Eugenie's perspective may not be entirely her own. Not in the sense of influence, but in shared experience. That others, too, may have felt the same unease, the same tension, the same quiet questioning of how things were unfolding behind closed doors. And while none of them have stepped forward in the way Eugenie has, the possibility that they understand her decision changes everything. Because if even a few share that understanding, then this isn't a single voice breaking away. It's the beginning of something collective, even if it remains unspoken. What makes this even more complex is how those potential alignments remain hidden beneath layers of expectation. Loyalty, in a structure like this, isn't optional, it's expected, maintained, protected. And yet, loyalty doesn't erase emotion. It doesn't silence doubt. It only forces those feelings into places where they can't be easily seen. So when someone like Eugenie steps outside that expectation, it doesn't just create distance, it creates pressure. Because now, others are forced to confront something they may have been avoiding. Not publicly, not yet, but internally, where the conflict is far more difficult to ignore. And with that pressure comes a question no one wants to answer. Where do you stand? Not in words, but in action. Do you maintain the appearance of unity, even if it no longer reflects reality? Or do you risk stepping into uncertainty, knowing the cost could be significant? Because the reality is, choosing silence is still a choice. And over time, even silence begins to reveal where loyalties truly lie. There are already signs, small, almost invisible, that something is shifting. Not dramatic, not definitive, but enough to suggest movement beneath the surface. A subtle rebalancing of presence, a hesitation where there was once certainty, a distance that feels intentional rather than incidental. And while none of it confirms anything outright, it adds to a growing sense that Eugenie's decision may have done more than disrupt it, may have exposed. But exposure comes with consequences, because once something is seen, even in fragments, it cannot be unseen. And for those who may quietly sympathize, the stakes are no longer theoretical. They are real, emotional, personal. Each decision, each appearance, each absence now carries weight. And the more this situation unfolds, the harder it becomes to remain neutral. That's what makes this moment so powerful and so dangerous, because actions like Eugenia's don't just create reaction, they create possibility, the possibility that others may follow, not immediately, not openly, but eventually. And if that happens, what once seemed like a singular act of defiance could evolve into something far more significant, a shift that reshapes not just relationships, but the entire balance within the institution itself. But while some may quietly support her, there's one person at the center of this storm who cannot afford to stay silent forever. In moments like this, silence can mean many things: control, calculation, or something far more unsettling. As Eugenie's refusal echoes through the palace, all eyes turn to Camilla, and yet there's nothing, no response, no denial, no visible reaction, just silence. And in that silence, a new question begins to take shape. Is this a strategic pause or a sign that something deeper is unfolding? Because silence, in a system built on precision and image, is never accidental. It is chosen, measured, designed to hold the line when words might fracture it further. And that is what makes this moment so psychologically charged. Camilla's lack of response does not close the story, it stretches it. It creates space, and in that space, uncertainty begins to expand. The absence of a reaction becomes its own kind of message, one that invites interpretation but refuses confirmation. And in a situation already layered with tension, that kind of ambiguity can be more powerful than any statement ever released. There is a long-standing understanding within royal crisis management that speaking too soon can be as damaging as saying nothing at all. Every word carries consequence. Every acknowledgement risks validating something that might otherwise remain contained. So the silence could be deliberate, a calculated decision to wait, to observe, to allow the situation to settle before stepping in. But the problem is, this situation doesn't feel like one that will settle. It feels like one that will grow, and with every passing moment, that silence begins to feel less like control and more like hesitation. Because being publicly challenged, even indirectly within a structure that depends on hierarchy, is not a small matter. It shifts perception. It introduces doubt, and even if that challenge is quiet, even if it is expressed through absence rather than confrontation, its impact is undeniable. Camilla now stands at the center of a narrative she did not initiate, yet cannot escape. And the longer she remains silent, the more that narrative begins to shape itself without her. There is also the emotional dimension, one that rarely surfaces but cannot be ignored, because behind the titles and expectations, there are still individuals navigating pressure, perception, and personal response. And to be placed in this position, where authority is subtly questioned without direct accusation, creates a tension that is difficult to resolve. Responding risks escalation, staying silent risks losing control of the narrative. Either path carries weight, either path carries consequence. What complicates this further is the growing awareness that silence does not freeze time, it accelerates speculation. It allows others to fill in the gaps, to construct meanings that may or may not reflect reality. And once those interpretations begin to take hold, they become difficult to undo. The longer the pause, the louder the questions become, not just about what happened, but about why there has been no response. And in that shift, the focus begins to move, not just toward Eugenia's decision, but toward Camilla's reaction to it, or lack of one. At some point, silence stops being neutral. It becomes a position, and that is the turning point no one can quite predict. Because once silence is perceived as intentional, it changes how everything else is interpreted. Every future move, every appearance, every absence, all of it begins to carry new meaning. And in a structure that relies so heavily on controlled messaging, that loss of clarity is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. Now the palace finds itself balancing on something fragile, trying to maintain composure while something underneath continues to shift, trying to project stability while uncertainty quietly builds, and at the center of it all is a silence that cannot last forever, but no one seems ready to break it. Because whether she responds or not, one thing is becoming increasingly clear: this situation is no longer containable. It was only a matter of time before the outside world caught on. What began as a quiet internal decision is now starting to ripple outward, reshaping how the public sees everything, because when a royal steps back this visibly, people notice, and when questions start forming, they don't stay contained for long. Suddenly, this isn't just a private matter, it's a narrative, one that's evolving faster than the palace can control. At first, it appeared as nothing more than a pattern, subtle, easy to overlook unless someone was paying close attention, an absence here, a missing appearance there. But patterns don't stay invisible forever. They invite curiosity. And curiosity, once sparked, doesn't fade quietly. It spreads. Conversations begin in small circles, then expand outward, gathering momentum with each new observation. Before long, what was once confined to private speculation becomes public intrigue. And now, people aren't just noticing, they're asking, why isn't Eugenie there? Why does the absence feel intentional? And more importantly, why hasn't anyone explained it? These questions don't exist in isolation. They build on one another, creating a narrative that no longer belongs solely to the palace. Because once the public begins to interpret silence, it becomes impossible to fully reclaim control of the story. Every missed event becomes a statement. Every non-appearance becomes a message, whether intended or not. The media, too, begins to shift its tone, not dramatically at first, but perceptibly. What was once framed as routine coverage starts to carry an undercurrent of tension. Words are chosen more carefully, phrases hint rather than declare, but beneath that restraint lies something unmistakable, a growing willingness to question the image of unity that has long been presented without challenge. And as those questions gain traction, the narrative begins to change shape. It becomes less about individual moments and more about what those moments suggest collectively. There is also an emotional response unfolding beyond headlines and commentary, because for many watching from the outside, Eugenia's decision doesn't just raise questions, it evokes something deeper. It feels like defiance, like someone quietly stepping outside a system that demands conformity. And that perceptio, whether accurate or not, carries weight. It resonates. It transforms what might have been seen as internal tension into something more universal, something people can connect to, interpret, even support. But with that connection comes risk, because the more this narrative grows, the harder it becomes to contain its impact. Reputation, carefully built over time, becomes vulnerable to interpretation, not because anything has been confirmed, but because uncertainty leaves room for assumption. And assumption, when repeated often enough, begins to feel like truth. That's the challenge the palace now faces, not just managing events, but managing perception. And perception, once it shifts, is incredibly difficult to guide back into place. Behind the scenes, the pressure intensifies. Every decision now carries an added layer of scrutiny. Every appearance is weighed not just for its purpose, but for how it will be perceived within this evolving narrative. The effort to maintain consistency becomes more complicated, more fragile, because the story is no longer being told from one place, it is being shaped by many voices, each adding their own interpretation, their own emphasis, their own sense of what this all means. And that is where the real transformation occurs. What began as a private moment, one decision, one refusal, has become something far larger, a storyline that continues to expand, drawing in attention, speculation, and emotion. It is no longer just about what happened behind closed doors. It is about what those events now represent in the public eye. And once a story reaches that point, it takes on a life of its own. And as the story grows louder, one final question looms: what happens if this refusal isn't temporary, but the beginning of something much bigger? A year doesn't sound long until you realize what can change in that time. For the royal family, 12 months can reshape reputations, redefine relationships, and expose truths that were never meant to surface. Eugenie's refusal isn't just about the present, it's about what happens next. Because if this distance continues, it won't just create space, it will create consequences that no one can predict. Because time, in a structure built on continuity, is never neutral. It doesn't simply pass, it transforms. Every missed appearance, every quiet absence, every moment where expectations are not met begins to accumulate, and over the course of a year, those moments don't fade into the background, they build into something undeniable. What starts as a decision becomes a pattern, and what becomes a pattern eventually reshapes perception, not just within the palace, but far beyond it. There is a weight to sustained absence that cannot be ignored. It forces adaptation, it forces questions, and most importantly, it forces reality to adjust around it. Events that once relied on a sense of unity must now operate without it. Relationships that once appeared steady begin to feel uncertain. And as that uncertainty lingers, it starts to influence everything: tone, presence, even the way interactions are interpreted. Because when someone steps back for this long, it stops looking temporary. It starts to feel permanent. But time doesn't only create distance, it tests it. It reveals whether separation softens tension or sharpens it, whether silence allows reflection or deepens division. And that is where the real uncertainty lies, because no one knows what 12 months of this will truly do. It could open a path toward understanding, toward quiet reconciliation, toward something that restores what has been disrupted, or it could do the opposite. It could solidify the divide, turning what once might have been repairable into something far more difficult to bridge. At the center of it all is a question that no one can yet answer. Is there a way back? Because decisions like this are not easily reversed. They carry emotional weight, not just in the moment they are made, but in every moment that follows. Each absence reinforces the boundary. Each choice not to return strengthens it. And over time, that boundary becomes part of the new reality, something that no longer feels like a reaction, but like a redefinition. What makes this even more powerful is the possibility that this isn't just a pause, it's a shift, a quiet but significant change in how roles are understood, how relationships are navigated, how presence itself is defined within the monarchy. Because when one person redraws their position so clearly, it doesn't just affect them, it alters the balance for everyone else. It creates new expectations, new uncertainties, new questions that didn't exist before. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of all. Not what has already happened, but what it might lead to. Because once change begins at this level, it rarely stays contained, it expands, it influences, it evolves into something larger than the moment that started it. And as that process unfolds, the palace is left to navigate something it cannot fully control: time itself, and everything it brings with it. Because in the end, this isn't just about Eugenie, and it was never just about Camilla, it's about what happens when silence finally turns into action. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.